My name's Glen. It's great to be here. Great to see everybody. I'm an addict in recovery. So as a famous songwriter once said, Joni Mitchell, if the story is to be meaningful, you have to be the hero and the anti-hero of the same story. For sure, I was the anti-hero in this story, pushing against, resisting, and trying to get my way at every turn. But by the providence of God, I was also a co-hero in this story. That is to say, I eventually cooperated with God. He really is the hero in this story. I was born at a very young age in Gander, Newfoundland. Thank you. I was hoping I'd get a chuckle on that one. To a once divorced World War II vet and his new bride, both from the Maritimes. We moved to Ottawa when I was only a few months old. Dad had a son from his first marriage who was 12 years older than my brother and I was the youngest of 3 boys. Growing up, I was not in need of anything except the emotional nearness of my dad. He was closed off, being a war vet, as was his own father, who died before he was born. He never knew how to be there for his sons, except to provide material needs for us. As a result, excuse me, I was never given much affirmation from him as a kid, and later as a young man. So I did what so many young men did. I looked for my masculine affirmation elsewhere. That was in wine, women, and song, or sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So, but for me, and to be honest, the most accessible thing for me, and this was all subconscious, by the way, was to take my question to a woman. As John Elridge would say, the question is, do I have what it takes to be a man? A question I would later understand that can only be properly answered by a father, and ultimately by the father. So growing up through the middle school and high school, I was constantly looking for an answer to my question. Music, drugs, and sex were always the 3 things I continually asked this question to. And if I had to ask the question over and over, was I getting an answer? Probably not. But I was learning a way of self-medicating because I was never getting an answer, never getting the affirmation my heart was longing for. And I remember in my early years, I was interested in spiritual things. I even remember going to Sunday school once with a friend. But we as a family, we never attended church. That's a whole other story, anyway. But it wasn't until my first year in high school, when I fell in love for the first time, that I had a revelation that God really existed. I thought in my young mind, if I can feel this overwhelming love for another person, then God is real, because love is real. That feeling faded for me within a few months, as she graduated from high school and going off to university, and I was left to start grade 10. Music was a mainstay for me. I was playing trumpet in the school bands, but later that year I bought an album by a band called Deep Purple, and the album was called Machine Head. When I heard the sound of that Rickenbacker 4001 through a Marshall tube amp, I thought it was the coolest sound ever. And from that moment, I wanted to be a bass player, and I did. So throwing myself into music and forming a band with my brother and 2 other friends from school, I became slowly more active in weekend parties, which involved beer and pot smoking. I grew my hair long, believe it or not, to look like my musical heroes, and discovered that cannabis products were easier to get than alcohol, and I could use them during the day and not get caught, or so I thought. By the time I finished grade 12, I remember looking back on that school year later and realizing I was pretty much stoned every day, and if I wasn't, I wanted to be. My last year of high school, I went to another art school to do my grade 13. I know I'm dating myself, the grade 13 thing. Yeah. I made a whole new group of friends, one of which was a deep spiritual seeker who would be instrumental in my jump into the real spiritual life. After a couple of summers working up the Northwest Territories and in the winter starting a job in Canada at a computer factory, I had a mental breakdown. And because I had used drugs such as mescaline and LSD, I used the common nomenclature of the time, calling it an acid flashback. I hardly slept for a week, and I was hallucinating, and my parents took shifts by my bedside, keeping vigil. It was at that point when I remembered my spiritual friend from grade 13 and her words to me about how to become a Christian. As I was lying in my bed, imagining, and the imaginary helicopters on the roof and the tanks outside my bedroom window subsided, I had imagined my stomach had just imploded. So quite certain that blood would start coming out of my mouth and I was soon to die any second, I crawled on my hands and knees down the hallway into the kitchen. And I stood up with my arms outstretched, and I said out loud, it was 3 a.m. in the morning, by the way, I said, Jesus, if you are real, come into my life. I immediately felt a warm sensation come into my fingers, my hands, my arms, and all of me. I was astonished, and all I could say was, you're real. You're real. Part 2. By the summer of that year, this was 1980 and 1981, I think, I was back up north and I started attending a Hay River Baptist Church. Total congregation size was 30, including all the kids and the dogs. It was a good place for me to start my journey of faith. I returned to Ottawa in autumn and joined a charismatic church. I got involved in the music ministry, and after a few years was one of the main worship leaders. I was an active member in the fellowship and became a deacon as well. After a few failed engagements, I found my bride. We got married, we eventually bought a house, and we were raising our 2 kids. But lurking below the surface was something unseen. Though things looked pretty good on the outside, I had not taken my question to God. I had stopped drinking, drugs, and smoking, but there was a part of my life that I would only share with a few people. I had kept a habit of pornography and fantasy going on in my life since I was about 12 years old. I got into the cycle of acting out, confessing to 1 or 2 close brothers, feeling the guilt lifted, and then going back out there soon after. It caused much pain for me, for my wife, and strained our marriage, especially as the addiction escalated into visiting massage parlors. But the real blow to my marriage didn't happen until I had a brief affair with someone at work. And it was devastating beyond words. For a time, I was excommunicated from the church fellowship as a means of discipline, and as my wife and I tried for almost 3 years to mend our relationship, the trust was broken, and I was tearfully asked to leave. Living on my own, renting a room, and studying for a new career full-time. Even though I was on antidepressants for the first time in my life, and I would cry myself to sleep most nights, I still was taking my questions to the ladies. I pursued hookups and one-night stands, looking for fulfillment, but never finding it. And Sunday night was the hardest night of the week. It would be when I would take the kids back to her place and ride the bus home. And it was one of those Sunday nights that I discovered that if I got off the bus one stop early, I could go into this bar and have a few drinks. Wow, people really do drown their sorrows. And I drank it in deeply. Within a year, I stopped going to church and pursued my new professional career and my drinking career. Soon, all my friends were drinking buddies, and I had hardly any contact with any church-going friends. I eventually got back into playing music in bars this time, playing at many open jams and sitting in with different bands and forming bands. Eventually, being surrounded by it, living a life of full-blown debauchery, I got into cocaine, using it and selling it. I thought I was living the high life, and I was for many years, until little by little, I lost everything. A 6-figure salary in the IT field, my house, my recording studio, but most of all, my self-dignity. There were a few attempts by one of my closest friends in church to win me back to the Lord, but I blindly staggered on with my empty life. This went on for a very long time, 26 years to be exact. So fast forward to September of 2021, when in desperation I quit my job at Staples. I hung my shingle out on social media as a photographer and producer, and I asked God, I called him the universe at this point. I asked him to meet me as I stepped out in faith. My phone rang, once for a musical gig and once for a job offer from a friend on Facebook who wanted to hire me as a real estate photographer. We hit it off immediately, so I invited her to my blues gig on the weekend. Within 4 days of meeting her, I asked her to marry me. Yeah, I did. And she said yes. So I jumped in with both feet, and I moved in with her. Now, she was a church-going lady, and I thought, oh yeah, I know how to do church. I've done that before. And at the end of one of the first church services I went to with her, I was weeping on the shoulder of the young pastor at a country church in Osgood. I had come back to the Lord. And I thought it was kind of poetic of the Lord to get to me again through the love of a woman. He knows the best way to get a hold of all of us. To be brief about what happened next, my exciting and highly romantic love affair and engagement ended badly, very badly. And I was stuck house sitting in the middle of the country with no income, no car, no money, and I was being evicted, and I had nowhere to go. I had made contact with old church friends, not the least of which was Doug, my oldest and closest Christian friend whom I spoke of earlier. And one day he said to me, hey, how about Jericho Road? And I said, what's Jericho Road? So he explained to me it was a 9-month residential addiction treatment center. I thought, well, I've had addictions and substance abuse issues in the past. I'm okay now, but okay, I'll go. It's true. But the truth of the matter was, I was cornered. I was desperate. Like a wild stallion who had been used to doing whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, God cornered me. The Father knew the best way to bring me into his fold, and this was it. And he gently corralled me and brought me into a place of discipline. And the Bible says that he disciplines everyone he loves and receives as a son. I was truly home, finally. And through the program at Jericho Road, I have learned some tools to help me on my path to real wholeness and healing. But the biggest thing so far for me is honesty. Being honest and vulnerable with myself, another human being, and God. I feel like my life is kind of just begun. And something I've often been accused of by people is I act like a child when I'm excited and motivated and passionate about something. So if I'm finally starting my true life at this ripe old age, I think it's okay to have an excitement and joyful abandon of a child. So I'm going to be a year sober on the 4th of January this year. And the best is yet to come. Stay tuned for part 3.